Hello everyone, it's Mr. Moomaw again. Welcoming you back to another tour of history with Mr. Moomaw. I believe this is video number 11. It's 11 videos I've done. I originally had planned on having a more interactive experience. That was what we tried to set up. I don't think, well, it didn't work. Unfortunately, there was bandwidth issues and things like that. So the videos were really sort of a fallback thing. And so I had to learn to make these videos and edit them and everything as I went. I don't have any experience doing this. So I hope it's turned out okay. I hope you're getting a lot out of this. I really do. I regret not being able to come down more often. I had really hoped to be able to come down Tuesday, which I guess is when you're seeing this today. That didn't work. My car died, and well, I have two cars. One of them died, and my wife needs the other one, so I'm not able to come down. And I'm very sorry about that because I really do enjoy coming down there and seeing all of you. It's nice to put see my audience, I guess, but it's nice to be there to see Miss Hahn and Miss McCall as well in McClellanville. So, well, without further ado, let me move on. I'm going to try to make this video shorter than the last one, I should say, because the last one I think went to be like 55 minutes, and it was a lot to cover, and I wanted to make sure I had it all covered. But this one will hopefully be a little bit shorter, talking today about the age of Jackson, some very important things that happened during just before and during the presidency of Andrew Jackson that are going to have very important ramifications later on. I'm going to try to do like I did last time, where I insert the slides in with the video. I'm going to put it at the end also so you can see it. I'm going to send a copy down to Miss Hahn and Miss McCall so that you can watch at your leisure when you just log on to the YouTube channel or whatever format they have that's available for you. All right, so let's talk Age of Jackson. And I don't know if you guys know this, as I'm talking to you, I'm flipping through the slides so I can make sure I'm hitting what's on the slides as they come up. So you know. All right. In the first place, we got the War of 1812. We've got this American literature, this burgeoning American literature. We've got the Second Great Awakening. All of this takes place within a tremendous outpouring of nationalism. Nationalism is one of those very nebulous words. People think they know what it means, but it always ends up meaning something else. Nationalism, if you read John Lukács, for example, John Lukács distinguishes between nationalism and patriotism, whereas patriotism is attachment to a society, a country. Nationalism is more fundamental. It's blood and language and shared history, shared culture, things like that. So patriotism is kind of the system, whereas nationalism is the people. It's one way of looking at it. And I think that works for us. American nationalism takes off after the War of 1812. Nationalism is a big thing all over the place in the Western world, but especially in America. We see a lot of things come out of that. With Second Great Awakening, with Mormonism comes out of that. The idea of an American religion, it's a big part of Mormonism's success. But alongside of this, well, not really alongside of this, but with this develops this idea of manifest destiny that we're going to talk about later on next time. This urge to spread and dominate the continent that we're going to talk about next time. It's going to lead ultimately into the Civil War. But today what I want to talk about is how this nationalism plays out in the Andrew Jackson administration, because it's very important. Andrew Jackson is a nationalist, first and foremost. He's from South Carolina. He grew up in Tennessee, or he spent his formative years in South Carolina, but he moved to Tennessee where his political career and his legal career and his planter career, military career, all took place. So he lived in the South, and one might expect when you think South to think of, the planter class were very devoted to our section of the country. Andrew Jackson's not a sectionalist. The people we've talked about so far aren't really sectionalists. Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, up until we talk about it here, they're all nationalists. As Warhawks, we talked about this. They're nationalists. These are people who are looking for the success of America as a whole, not one part of it, not what's good for New England, what's good for the frontier, what's good for the South, what's good for whatever. They're talking about what's good for America. Obviously, what Andrew Jackson thinks is good for America is Andrew Jackson, which we're going to talk about here in a second when he runs for president. But generally, these guys want they want to expand. They want the infrastructure. They want the capital to be able to produce it. This is where you're going to see some conflicts with Henry Clay, who loves his bank, and Andrew Jackson, who doesn't like the bank. A lot of reasons he doesn't like Henry Clay. So keep that idea of nationalism in your mind as we roll through this, because it's going to pop up over and over again, not just here, but throughout the rest of the semester. And we're going to talk about how that plays out moving forward. Now, alongside of nationalism, well, not alongside, I already said that. All right. America is expanding. It's expanding not only when we talked about Northwest Territory, we talked about Louisiana Purchase, but America is expanding militarily as well. A lot of the wars the United States fight, especially the Creek War and the War of 1812, are about the United States consolidating at least what it has in theory. Remember, we own Louisiana, sure, but there are people who already live there who are not inclined to just give up their land and allow the United States to move in. The Creek War, in a lot of ways, is it's about the dispossession of these people, evicting them from their territory so that Americans can move in. Again, very popular. It's an age of nationalism. People have no problem running the Indians off their land and moving onto it and setting up America. The more America there is in the world, the better. So the Creek War is about expanding America, even though technically the line on the map says we're already there. But there's other things as well. When we talk about Manifest Destiny later on, we're going to talk about America's relationship with New Spain and later Mexico. But the actual conflict between the two, between the United States and Spain, comes about earlier even than that. And it comes about because of Andrew Jackson and because of the Creek War. Andrew Jackson fights the Red Sticks and defeats them. We talked about what happened with William Weatherford, Battle of Horseshoe Bend, crushes the Red Sticks. Well, the Creek don't just fold up, pick up stakes and move on. A lot of these really hardline Red Sticks, they move south. They go into what was then Spanish Florida. In Florida, they meet up with other Creeks who'd left their tribe, Cherokee, other Indian groups, and not just them, but renegade whites, runaway slaves, all kinds of people. And they merge together and form this tribe called the Seminole. Now, the Seminole, with the tacit encouragement of the Spanish government, raid across the border into Alabama, into Georgia, attacking plantations, looting, freeing slaves to augment their numbers, stuff like that. Well, Andrew Jackson's not very happy about this. And hot off his success in New Orleans in 1815, Andrew Jackson basically just invades Florida in response to these cross-border raids. Now, Jackson has permission to do this from the government, but he very quickly exceeds his permission. Jackson moves into Florida and just decides to, well, Jackson's a decisive man. He says, well, we got this problem with the Seminoles. Let's just get rid of the Seminoles, and for good measure, let's get rid of the Spanish. They're the real source of the problem anyway. Europe in the New World, that's the past. That's not what belongs in America at this point. So Jackson basically besieges Pensacola, takes it over on the understanding that either the Spanish government was helping the Seminoles, in which case they're our enemy, or they're not capable of stopping them, in which case they're our de facto enemy and they need to go, we need to take over. So Jackson fights the Seminoles, he burns villages, just he fought the Creeks, and he takes over Pensacola, drives the Spanish administration out. The Monroe administration, the president who's in power at this point, doesn't authorize him to do any of this. Jackson's kind of on his own initiative. Nobody told him to conquer Florida, but he does. On the gamble, basically, that the administration will end up backing him because they're satisfied with the results, which they are and which they do. The Monroe administration, through John Quincy Adams, who we're going to talk about here quite a bit in a minute, through John Quincy Adams, ends up purchasing Florida from Spain to smooth things over, and Florida now becomes part of the United States. Now, the Seminoles are beaten, but they are not defeated by any means. They will continue to be a thorn in the side of the U.S. government for decades after this. So keep that in mind. Jackson beat the Seminoles, did not defeat them. Now, it's the Adams-Onis Treaty that gets us Florida, by the way. So Spain is essentially, at this point, on its way out in in continental United States. Mexico, a few years later, is going to have a revolution. 1821, Augustin Iturbide is going to take over, and we'll talk about where that goes later. Now, politically speaking, Monroe administration backs Jackson. They're happy to have his success on board. There isn't a lot of success that comes out of the War of 1812. Jackson is a major hero. So in a lot of ways, he's able to kind of make his own orders, make his own Indian policy, make his own foreign policy, because he's a winner, and the administration of Madison before him and then Monroe are eager to tie themselves to this guy. So, but nonetheless, the big losers in all of this, Jackson's the big winner, the big losers in the whole political fallout from the War of 1812, obviously apart from the Indians, is the Federalist Party. It's dead. The Federalist Party at the Hartford Convention, where they're basically plotting secession, the war was going really, really, really bad, and then the Federalists looked like they were doing good, and then all of a sudden Jackson wins at New Orleans, this heroic victory. It just kind of flips things in the public mind. Even though the battle was after the war, it was so dramatic, and people were looking for some kind of victory so bad that they seized on that. And all of a sudden, the war, we were losing. Now, we won. And the Federalists, who were against this war from the start, now kind of look like the bad guys. They weren't on board with what was going on. And for other reasons. The country's expanding west. The Federalists, which are the party of Eastern merchants and people like that, it doesn't have any appeal over the Appalachians. So for those reasons and a few more, the Federalist Party basically dies out after the War of 1812, which means you have one party left, Democratic Republicans. And this becomes known as the era of good feelings. There's only one political party. Everybody gets along. At least that's the theory. When James Monroe runs for president, he runs unopposed. Nobody runs against him, so everybody's happy, at least on the surface. The problem is that just shifts the conflict from the between party level to the party level. In other words, people aren't fighting for the presidency, they're fighting for the Democratic-Republican nomination, which is just as vicious. And this comes to a head once Monroe has gone through his 2 customary terms and is getting ready to leave office. Now, who's going to succeed him? Who's going to get the Democratic-Republican nomination? Well, you have on the one hand William Crawford. William Crawford is the Secretary of the Treasury. He's from Georgia. He's well liked. You have then Henry Clay. Henry Clay is the Speaker of the House. We've talked a lot about Henry Clay. Henry Clay is a great legislator. He really wants to be president, and he'll run for president several times in the future. John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams we've talked about very, very briefly before. He's John Adams' son. He's one of these New England guys, just like his father, brilliant, hard to get along with. And he has been Monroe's Secretary of State for the whole duration of his term. Monroe he negotiated that Adams-Onis Treaty. More than anybody, it's John Quincy Adams who's responsible for this Monroe Doctrine, which, again, very nationalistic, follows hard on the heels of this conquest of Florida, which is basically the United States is no longer going to permit any further European colonization of the New World. No more colonies, no more Europeans taking over things. That's done. America is now the dominant power in the New World. That's the Monroe Doctrine. Second semester, we're going to talk about Theodore Roosevelt and the Roosevelt Corollary to that. So, understand that about the Monroe Doctrine. So, what do you get? Well, Crawford, well, he's out. Actually, let me flip to the side. We're just got a big X through his face. Crawford's out. He has a stroke, unfortunately. I've been there. And has a stroke and is felled by it. His stroke was much worse than mine were. And so he's out of the running. So now it's down to Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and I forgot to mention, Andrew Jackson. Jackson throws his hat in the ring in 1824 because he is convinced that things are not going well in Washington. He remembers back in the War of 1812 the terrible time he had getting supplies for his men from a corrupt and bloated War Department. He sees that politics, he sees it anyway, is driven by corruption and special deals and backroom bargains and all these sorts of things. Plus, he's an ambitious man, and Jackson is not averse to hearing people whisper in his ears about what a great president he'd make, how he could fix everything if he wanted to. So for those reasons and more, Jackson runs for president. Now, results come in, and nobody's the winner. It's one of those elections where nobody's won a clear majority, and thus, or nobody's won enough of the votes to where, electoral votes to where it would, one person's third the president. So the election goes to the House of Representatives, where guess who? Henry Clay is the Speaker of the House. Now Henry Clay is number 3 in this sweepstakes. In other words, Andrew Jackson has the most votes, but not enough to win. John Quincy Adams is number 2, and Clay is number 3. So Clay can't win the election, but even more importantly, he can decide who can. So that's when Henry Clay starts putting out feelers. Hey, what would an Adams administration have to offer Henry Clay? What role could he expect to fill in that regard? Well, Andrew Jackson gets these people come to him, and Andrew Jackson rebuffs them. Andrew Jackson doesn't want anything to do with this kind of corruption. What actually happens with John Quincy Adams isn't all that clear. John Quincy Adams was not a personally corrupt man, unlike Henry Clay. But John Quincy Adams was, on one level, afraid of Jackson. This is the age of Napoleon. Napoleon's come and gone, but this is the age of people who are inspired by him. Jackson has come from nowhere to be this military power, so did Napoleon. It doesn't help that Jackson very openly admires Napoleon. So for those reasons, John Quincy Adams looks at Andrew Jackson as a very dangerous guy, not someone you want to give power. So what exactly happened? Well, the end result sort of speaks for itself. Henry Clay wheedles enough votes to get John Quincy Adams made president. Once John Quincy Adams is president, Henry Clay is immediately named his Secretary of State, which means he's, at this point, Secretary of State is pretty much the guy who ends up running for president later on. Andrew Jackson is furious. How did he end up with more votes than anybody else and lose the presidency? And he and his supporters claim there is a corrupt bargain. Now, because Jackson's supporters view the results of the election as just completely illegitimate, it really helps to destabilize the Adams administration throughout its term. And this causes John Quincy Adams no end of problems. So, John Quincy Adams is president, things aren't going well for him, and Andrew Jackson in 1828 runs again, 4 years later, against a weakened John Quincy Adams. This time, Andrew Jackson wins, but not without cost. This election, the 1828 election, was absolutely vicious. Both sides sling mud back and forth at the other. Andrew Jackson's people call John Quincy Adams a gambler, a man who doesn't take Sunday church services seriously, buys gaming equipment for the White House. John Quincy Adams, his own money, had purchased a pool table basically for the White House, and they made it sound like he was opening a casino in the White House and wild parties and stuff. They basically took a guy who's one of the most straight-laced nerds in American history and turned him into like Hugh Hefner or something. John Quincy Adams' people, on the other hand, said that Andrew Jackson was a violent man who had engaged in duels, public brawls, that he'd killed people, that he'd had people when he was in the War of 1812 hung, that when he invaded Florida, he'd hung 2 British nationals that he really didn't even have authority to do, that he was constantly taking the army places he wasn't supposed to. In other words, everything they said was true, which we know already about Andrew Jackson. But where they crossed the line, especially as far as Andrew Jackson was concerned, where they crossed the line was when they went after his wife. We talked about this a little bit. Andrew Jackson married his wife, Rachel Robards, who had been Rachel Donaldson, the big Donaldson family in Tennessee. Now, when he married her, she was technically already married to another man, a guy named Louis Robards. We talked about this. Jackson just chased him into the woods with a knife, and he never caused any problems again. And then they got married, and then they found out that she was technically legally still married to this guy. Now, the story Jackson always went with was that they thought she was divorced. Back then, you actually had to petition the state legislature and get a special bill passed that divorced you, which took a lot of time. And Jackson said, "Well, we thought she was divorced, and we found out later on that she wasn't, so we fixed that, but it was just technicality." Historians think what probably really happened was that divorces were hard to come by in those days. You had to get a writ from the legislature essentially, and so they basically just didn't bother with it. At this point, Andrew Jackson isn't that famous of a man. He never expected to have this big public career. And so at the time, people on the frontier just kind of understood. Like Ben Franklin, his wife was technically married to another man also. He'd gone off to sea. Nobody knew if he lived or died, so technically she's still this guy's wife. But everybody realized they're together. Whatever the law says, they're essentially married. Well, that works fine in the Enlightenment times or on the frontier, but in the society that's developing in America in the wake of the Second Great Awakening, this intensely moralistic society, this idea that develops about the sanctity of women in the home, Rachel Jackson is painted in very lurid terms, as if she was just married to two men at the same time, and just painted as just a whore, really. They say horrible things about her. It's everything his handlers can do to keep Jackson from actually calling people out and shooting them. People put up a lot of stuff from a president at this point, but getting involved in a shootout is not one of them. Well, Jackson ends up winning, and he's very happy, and his wife's happy, and she goes to Nashville to buy a dress for the inauguration. And the story goes, I don't know how exactly accurate this is, but the story that historians, I guess, like is that she's in Nashville looking for a dress, and she finds a pamphlet from the campaign. And Jackson, she lives in about 9 miles outside of Nashville. He's able to keep visitors from talking about the election and keep the mail away from her. So she really doesn't have any idea that people are saying all these horrible things about her. She's this little old grandmotherly woman with a big family and likes to bake pies and stuff like that. And picks up a pamphlet, and she finds out she's the biggest whore in America. And she has a heart attack. And they take her back to the Hermitage, and she dies. And this profoundly affects Andrew Jackson. In the first place, on one level, he blames himself for putting her through this. He'd spent a third of their marriage essentially away from home, in Congress, at war. He didn't spend as much time with her as he could have, and he feels guilty about that. He'd always hoped to retire and be with her, and he's running for president. But on a more fundamental and violent level, he blames John Quincy Adams, and he blames Henry Clay. This has an important impact later on. This personal problem that Andrew Jackson has with these men has political implications later on. Jackson is a man who's intensely devoted to his family. He's an orphan. He has no mother, no father, no brothers, nothing. It's just him. And he married into this big Donaldson family. And his connection with his wife meant absolutely everything to him. And we think of him as being this fierce, violent man, which he was. But at the same time, he does love his wife. And a part of him, really the most stable part of him, died with her. And this plays out immediately in a very bizarre scandal as soon as Jackson takes office. Jackson brings in his crew, fires everybody that's there, as many people as he can, really, in the name of cleaning house, getting rid of all the corrupt people, and he brings in his own guys. His vice president, Martin Van Buren, calls it the spoils system. In other words, to the victor go the spoils. We won, so we get to dole out the offices. I don't know if you guys realize this. Political offices, when you have a job that allows you to hire people, well, that's just a great way to reward your friends and supporters. So Jackson brings on all his buddies from Tennessee, including a guy named John Eaton, who serves as his Secretary of War. They didn't have defense back then, they had war. Well, John Eaton had been hanging out with a woman named Peggy Timberlake. She was married to a guy named Justin Timberlake. I just said Justin. John Timberlake. I was going to make a Justin Timberlake joke, and then it jumped ahead of me. His name is not Justin Timberlake, John Timberlake. Well, he goes out to seas in the Navy, and he dies. And when he dies, word gets back to back to Washington, and it kind of causes a little minor scandal because John Eaton's been hanging out with Peggy Timberlake so much. So Andrew Jackson says, "Look, this is causing me problems. You need to marry her." Well, John Eaton marries Peggy Eaton, or John Eaton marries Peggy Timberlake, who becomes Peggy Eaton, and weirdly, this causes Andrew Jackson more problems than anything else in his entire administration, because none of the other cabinet members' wives or any foreign dignitary's wife will be seen in a room with her. As far as they're concerned, she was cheating on her husband when they were married. She was, interacting with this guy in a way that was not appropriate. And if she's allowed to hang out with them, her sort of poor nature will rub off on them in terms of their reputation. So they refuse to have absolutely anything to do with her. This angers Jackson quite a bit. Like I said, his mental state, he's grieving, he's intensely sad. And in Peggy Eaton, he kind of sees a lot of his wife. People being mean to her, all this gossip and backstabbing type stuff. And really, incorrectly, Peggy Eaton was, by all accounts, not the most pleasant woman, unlike Rachel Jackson. Well, so he orders his cabinet members to order their wives to hang out with her, and they won't. Andrew Jackson, understand, is a man who went to the White House with 3 bullets in his body, none from war, all from private disputes. He survived malaria, smallpox, dysentery. He went through the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812. He fought the Creek. He fought the Seminoles, chased the Spanish out of Florida. Andrew Jackson could not budge these women 1 inch. And he's looking around for who to blame. And he realizes that the ringleader of all these women is Floride Calhoun, the wife of his vice president at the time, John C. Calhoun. Now, Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun already kind of don't see too eye to eye. Into this breach comes Martin Van Buren, who is Secretary of State originally. Martin Van Buren insinuates himself into this and says, "Yeah, that John C. Calhoun never really had your back to begin with. Did you know that when you were invading Florida, doing your patriotic duty, that he was back here in Washington trying to just basically disavow what you're doing and urging the administration to do that?" Martin Van Buren, please understand, is a bachelor. He doesn't have a wife. In fact, he's just kind of alley cats around town, as it were. But he has no wife, which means he's perfectly happy to associate with Peggy Eaton and hang out with them, which makes Andrew Jackson very happy. And Martin Van Buren slowly but surely becomes his right-hand man. They're very different people in a lot of ways. Andrew Jackson, this rough frontiersman. Martin Van Buren, this upper-class guy from New York, always dresses very fancy. Rumored to be the illegitimate son of Aaron Burr. Now I'm going to let you look at the slide, and I want you to look at the picture at the bottom. That's Martin Van Buren, and Aaron Burr is a young man. And I want you to look at them and tell me if you think they look alike. Historians dispute the idea that he was Aaron Burr's son. We'll see. But anyway, so Martin Van Buren, possibly the reincarnation of Aaron Burr, who knows. But Martin Van Buren gets between Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun and basically helps further this rift for his own political ends. And plus, he really doesn't like John C. Calhoun and thinks John C. Calhoun is a negative impact. John C. Calhoun has no any more control over his wife than any of these other guys have over their wives. They steadfastly refuse to associate with her, with Peggy Eaton, and Andrew Jackson never, ever, ever, ever succeeds in winning. Eventually, he posts John C. Calhoun to an ambassadorship overseas to kind of help get her out of Washington, where hopefully it won't be a problem. But this rift between Jackson and Calhoun has important implications. Along with Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun is now on his enemies list. And this is going to result in a big shift in John C. Calhoun's politics as well. Oh, this, by the way, I didn't even mention the name. This is what's called the petticoat affair. A petticoat is like a type of women's undergarment. So petticoat affair is a way of saying it's not very serious. There's a bunch of women arguing. But interestingly, it does have important political implications. Oops, wrong thing. Now, apart from trying to get women to get along with each other, Jackson has other policy goals. The most important of which is getting rid of the Indians. There's a lot of reasons why Indian removal happens. The most obvious is that there's tremendous popular pressure to move the Indians out of the remaining lands they have east of the Mississippi so that they can be settled by white Americans. Man, that nationalism again. Apart from that, there's also this realization among a lot of people that there really is no future for them there. That as long as the Indians live east of the Mississippi, they're going to gradually get enveloped by this expanding American society. Their lands are going to just steadily be constricted. They're going to intermarry. Everything that's distinct about them is going to disappear. So Jackson, in 1830, pushes for and receives from Congress the Indian Removal Act, which basically authorizes the government to pay all the Indian tribes east of the Mississippi to vacate their land and move west of the Mississippi to territory that's been designated for them in perpetuity. So, in other words, the government goes around to tribe after tribe and says, we would like to pay you for your land, and it's not really a choice, so here's what we're offering, you take it and move across the Mississippi and we'll tell you where to go. Tribe after tribe after tribe is forced to sell out and move. And there is this mass exodus of people from places that they had inhabited for 10,000 years, some of them, over the land across the Mississippi. Alexis de Tocqueville, who you're going to read, actually witnessed just columns of Indians moving west, and commented on it, just how you're literally watching one world disappear and another world remain. Now, Andrew Jackson, interestingly, and this was always a problem the government had. What are the Indian tribes as far as we're concerned? They're not are they foreign countries, or are they essentially part of America? What are they? Well, for Jackson, he said, well, look, if we're going to treat them like they're independent, one of two things. You can treat them like they're independent countries, in which case you can't have a country in the middle of another country. So if you want to be a sovereign nation, essentially, you've got to move out of America. If, however, you want to be part of America, you're welcome to stay. And a lot of Indians elect to do that. You have to detribalize. You can't, I'm not part of this group. I don't know any political allegiance to them. You settle and just sort of blend in with remaining white society, which a lot of them do. Now, the main group that contests this are the Cherokee. And they don't do what the Red Sticks did, which is just go to war. The Cherokee go to court. The Cherokee are one of these 5 civilized tribes we talked about. They live in towns. They wear European-style clothes. The Europeans, remember, the ones that, 5 civilized tribes. They wear European-style clothes. A Cherokee named Sequoyah has come up with an alphabet for the Cherokee. They print newspapers. The Cherokee Nation has written a constitution. Every adult male Cherokee can vote. Obviously, slaves can't. They got lots of slaves. And so they've really done everything they need to do to create a country. For Andrew Jackson, that's the problem. They've made this little country within the wider United States, and so you've either got to move somewhere else where you can have a country or stay here and not be one. It also didn't help that the people of Georgia discovered there was gold on Cherokee land. Well, to make a very complicated story pretty simple, the Cherokee go to court, the case gets all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says basically, Andrew Jackson, you have no right to evict these people if they do choose to sell out their land. Andrew Jackson basically ignores this ruling. He does what he wants. And Jackson orders the Indians removed anyway. And so the Cherokee are sent off on the famous Trail of Tears with the entire tribe, picks up stakes and move with their slaves and everything they own, and they move them out to Oklahoma and Arkansas. And that's it for Indians east of the Mississippi. Their tribes, their territories, what they've had for, we talked almost 10,000 years, some of them, all gone, just like that. And there's nothing left but the people who chose to remain, who married into white society. That girl with the long black hair, the aquiline nose, she has ghosts in her blood. Now, obviously, recently things have changed a little bit. There are reservation lands that are opening back up. Cherokees, for example, in Tennessee, North Carolina, they've resettled some of that area. There are lands east of Mississippi now. They're designated for Indian tribes. But obviously, it's nothing like it was. And that's largely due to Andrew Jackson. There's nothing about it that reflects well on the government, I should say. And to have read so far about the Americans encountering the Indians, and the fighting and the war, and how hard the fighting, Pontiac, the brutality, all this stuff. To end that way is, as a narrative speaking, anticlimactic. It's sad how it ends in every way. Well, Jackson has other policy goals, though. For example, he wants to get rid of banks. Or at least I should say not banks. He wants to get rid of that second bank of the United States. Henry Clay's baby. What Henry Clay wants for that American system we talked about. He wants that bank to back up all the other banks so he can have access to, basically public capital or the infrastructure projects that he wants and everything. Well, Andrew Jackson doesn't like banks to begin with. A lot of these Southern planters view banks as kind of their enemy. After all, banks are capitalism, banks are industry, bankers are people who make money off of just sitting around and letting other people use their money. There's something kind of off and parasitic about it, as far as Andrew Jackson's concerned. Of course, the main thing is Henry Clay likes it, and he hates Henry Clay because he blames Henry Clay for basically killing his wife. So, if nothing else, Henry Clay's against it, or Henry Clay's for it, so he's against it. Well, Henry Clay introduces a bill to reauthorize the Second Bank of the United States 2 years ahead of time. Andrew Jackson takes the bill and he vetoes it. It's the first time anybody's vetoed a law. And Henry Clay is quite upset about this and proposes to put it back in again. And Andrew Jackson decides to take this opportunity to get rid of the bank. At this point, in other words, the bank still has 2 years of existence left, according to his legal charter, but Andrew Jackson decides, we might as well just get rid of it now. So he orders his Treasury Secretary to remove all the government's deposits. The guy says, I don't think I can do that legally. Andrew Jackson says, I understand your stance, and fires him. Brings in another guy. That guy says he can't do it either. Andrew Jackson fires him, and finally the third guy gets the message and pulls out the government money. So the Second Bank of the United States basically collapses, and Andrew Jackson, all basically the financial decisions revert down to all these state banks. This has a lot of negative long-term economic repercussions. There's a big economic depression that happens in 1837. Historians will differ about this, but a lot of them tie it directly to Andrew Jackson's problems he has with these banks, because now all these little state banks don't have a big national bank to borrow money from if they need it. If they go overboard, they print money without any regard to who else is printing money, so the money supply isn't stable. And this will be a recurring issue in America right up until the founding of the Federal Reserve in the early 1900s. Now, Jackson, like we mentioned before, he doesn't like Calhoun. He and Calhoun had this falling out over the Petticoat affair, among other things. I mean, they were kind of going two different ways anyway, but the real falling out is over this Petticoat affair. And Calhoun, his politics start to evolve now. Calhoun becomes more of a sectionalist. He used to be a nationalist, rah-rah America. Now he's thinking more and more about the South, and he's looking at the changes that are happening in the United States, and he's thinking long-term, and he's saying, this is not good. This doesn't bode well for our way of life in the South. This is based on plantation agriculture and all that. This doesn't bode well. Capitalism expanding, banks are expanding, this Unitarianism, social gospel fueled abolitionist movement is expanding. For Calhoun, all of these things are tied together: banks, industry, abolitionism, just a sort of combination package of everything negative about the Yankees, the people from New England that he really just doesn't like. And so he starts advocating more and more for positions that are favorable to the South as opposed to the whole country. Now, there had been a tariff put in place that, we talked about Henry Clay, protective tariff and all that. The tariff really helps the people manufacturing in New England, but it hurts the people in the South because they have to pay more for manufactured goods, things that they get from overseas, stuff like that. So when this tariff comes back up and they refuse to lower the rate, Calhoun, who's in the Senate at this point, says, well, South Carolina, we have the right to nullify a federal law within our borders. In other words, state government trumps federal government within its own borders. You pass this law, we decide it's not in our best interest, it doesn't apply here. This is a perennial problem with the Constitution. It doesn't spell out 100% clearly whether the federal government or the various state governments are going to be more powerful. It takes a civil war for that to happen. But Calhoun basically says we have the right to nullify this law. Andrew Jackson, who takes anything like any challenge like that personally, says, no, you don't. Calhoun says, yes, we do. Andrew Jackson says, well, in that case, I'm going to have to do something about this. Calhoun and South Carolina say, go for it. This is the nullification crisis, and it gets pretty tense. South Carolina government calls out the militia. Andrew Jackson puts the word out that he might need volunteers for an army that he's going to march off with as the head of to invade South Carolina. He sends word down to South Carolina that he's going to send people down there to collect this tax, and if anybody messes with them, he's going to march in with an army and hang every single legislator he finds by the nearest available tree. So things are tense, and there's not really an easy way to stop this. Who saves the day? Who else? Henry Clay. Henry Clay solves all these problems. Henry Clay comes in and says, all right, let's work out a compromise. We'll lower the tariff, and then you back down from this nullification idea, and that'll be that. So both sides save face, and they pull back from what essentially South Carolina was threatening, which is secession. So this could easily have happened much, much earlier than it ended up doing. Andrew Jackson put a stop to it. Henry Clay was able to prevent South Carolina from breaking away and maybe taking other states with it. But South Carolina says we won't nullify this law. They don't acknowledge that they don't have the right to do this. And more people in the South are looking at this federal government and saying it's way too powerful. They're impinging on our way of life, and this doesn't bode well for the future, which, as we'll see, it doesn't. This conflict is going to lead to civil war. Now, Andrew Jackson leaves office. By the way, I should mention also, he's the only president to anyone ever tried to assassinate in office. Or the first president, I should say. Nobody tried to kill anybody before. He's walking back from a congressman's funeral. A crazy guy steps out from behind a column with a pistol in each hand, fires one pistol, it doesn't go off. Fires the other pistol, it doesn't go off. Everybody's just standing there. They're completely mystified. No one's ever tried to kill a president before. So Andrew Jackson starts beating the guy with his cane until they pull Andrew Jackson off of him, and they put the guy in an insane asylum. Well, Andrew Jackson leaves office, and Martin Van Buren follows hard on his heels. Martin Van Buren gets elected the next president and promptly inherits every problem caused by Jackson. The collapse of the bank helped lead to, historians differ like I said, helped lead to this economic collapse, the Panic of 1837. Businesses shut down, money's not available, all kinds of stuff. And Martin Van Buren gets a lot of the blame for this. In addition to that, you also get these political differences. There was just a Democratic-Republican Party, and now a new party emerges, led by Henry Clay, or at least coalesces kind of around him, the Whig Party, W-H-I-G. No, they were Whigs. W-H-I-G, the Whig Party. And the Whig Party kind of fills in that gap the old Federalists did. The Whig Party is pro-bank, pro-trade, pro-tariff. It's very much a Northerners, or at least a nationalists party. Whereas the Democrats become more and more a party. I mean, Democrats are always a national party, but more and more it's embraced almost exclusively by people in the South. So the South becomes a strong Democrat stronghold, whereas the Whigs help to start to flourish elsewhere. Now the Whigs, they aren't going to last too long, but they do become important for a very short time. Henry Clay is an important Whig. We're going to see Abraham Lincoln later on. He starts off as a Whig politician. Now, very last thing on here is Alexis de Tocqueville. I'm not going to talk about him too much. Oh, it's a fire alarm. Gotta run, it's a fire alarm.